Hi, everyone. I'm Bruno Aziza, and welcome to another episode of Data Journeys. This is the place we come to learn from data leaders, their lessons, their do's and don'ts, their journey. And today, we're talking to Edward from AutoTrader UK. They've got a really interesting use case, 3 petabytes of data, 4,000 dashboards, 34 data products they've built, reinvented the way they approach their data stack altogether. And so we're going to get right into that. But before we do that, Edward, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks, Bruno.
All right, so at your company, more than half the employees are using Looker. You got a lot of data. So first of all, tell us a little bit about what does AutoTrader UK do?
So AutoTrader is the UK's largest digital automotive marketplace. So effectively, we connect buyers and sellers of new and used vehicles through online classified adverts. And we've been doing this for the last 40 years. So we originally started as a print business. We were founded in the 1970s. And we've kind of been evolving as times have gone by. So we started our journey to digital in 1996 with our first website. By the way, that was, I think, 3 years before Google even existed. And we are now a fully digital business. In terms of some stats, we get in excess of 60 million cross-platform visits each month. We're around 8 times larger than our nearest competitor in the UK for the share of cross-platform minutes. And in the UK, more than 75% of all time spent on all automotive classified sites is on AutoTrader.
8 times larger than the nearest competitor. You've got 75% of all time spent on automotive classified is on your site. So you got a really good sense of what's happening in the industry. Now, we'll find out today that over half of your employees are using Looker. So you've also been able to really activate this data with your users. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about the unique challenges you had to work through in order to get to this stage.
The big one is the scale at which we operate. We're one of the largest websites in the UK. You mentioned some big stats there, 63 million cross-platform visits each month. So just working with that sheer volume of data, tracking user behavior, et cetera, at scale has certainly been a challenge. There's probably a couple of things that are fairly unique to us in the industry as well. One of the big ones is that we have a lot of anonymous cross-device usage. So people come to our site and they use it, but they don't necessarily register and sign in. And then they switch devices around. They browse on their smartphone, on the app. Then they load up their desktop browser and can continue their journey there. So tracking user behavior across these devices is a real challenge. We also struggle a little bit in that we have 2 distinct groups of users we want to do analytics about. So we have consumers who come to our site, they browse it, they interact with adverts, etc. They run searches. But we also have customers who are the car dealers who advertise with us. They're the people who pay us money. And the kind of analytical needs of those 2 groups of people are quite distinct.
And you've got a pretty sophisticated stack. You've got BigQuery, Bigtable, Looker, and you've kind of advanced your data products in a way that serves these multiple communities. Your migration had hundreds of stakeholders. So take us a little bit through that. Like, how did you approach your migration and how it relates to your data analytics strategy? Did you just do a standard lift and shift, or did you take a different approach?
We started by, first of all, we built a data lake. And then we started using Google BigQuery to take advantage of that. And that's where we started getting real traction. So the speed at which we were able to model data, build stuff out, and get it kind of deployed out to users really kind of was the catalyst that really got us going. Alongside there, we still had our old world. So we had an on-premise Oracle data warehouse, and that was driving most of our really high-profile, high-risk reporting. So things like financial reporting. And that's where we kind of needed to make sure that we had a mature platform we could migrate to before we started thinking about how we would go about moving that to the cloud. So for the last couple of years, we've been kind of, getting that migration underway, and it is now complete. We have powered off our on-premise servers, and we are now fully in the cloud when it comes to data analytics. But the success behind that project was the fact that we didn't just do a lift and shift. So working in the cloud means that we can approach things differently. BigQuery lets us work at a scale at which we simply just wouldn't have been able to in Oracle. So rather than just lifting and shifting our workloads as they were, we basically rebuilt them all from the ground up in our new data platform stack, using BigQuery, using dbt to model data, Looker for dashboard analytics, and Airflow for orchestration.
And tell me a little bit more about the capabilities you deployed using BigQuery that really kind of changed the game. I mean, you talked about financial reporting, which is high risk, right? It's going to be highly accurate. I'm sure there's regulations. There's all types of scrutiny around that. So you've got to keep that very tight. In addition to that, you got a changing platform. You got a changing talent, maybe. How did you work through that as you're kind of evolving to this new modern data stack?
Yeah. So, I mean, working with BigQuery and DBT meant that compared to our kind of previous footsteps into the cloud, so for example, working in a data lake, working with Spark, we were able to move much more quickly. But with that comes risk. So one of the key things that's kind of given confidence to our move to BigQuery has been building up testing around data, testing around DBT models, and automated monitoring and observability that then sits on top of that layer as well. So that lets us know if anything doesn't look right with what we've been modeling.
And was the financial reporting the main use case you drove, or were there others that you kind of went through as you were evolving?
There were a whole bunch of use cases. So financial reporting was probably the most high profile and high risk for us internally, but we had hundreds of stakeholders, both internally and externally. So people around the business who typically would receive reports via email, either every day, every week, every month. And some of those reports went out to external stakeholders as well.
So we talked about financial reporting here. That's one of the use cases. What were the other use cases, and was there any difference in now that you're on GCP and BigQuery, you're able to deploy them differently than you might have in the on-prem world?
Yeah, so we had a whole bunch of stakeholders, both internally and externally, effectively distributing data about who our customers are, how they're performing with us, how their adverts are performing, how customers are interacting with those customers, etc. And yeah, we did approach things differently in the cloud. So we've been kind of following this principle around the data mesh and decentralization, and that's really helping us. So for example, we would model an entity like a customer, and we have a team who are invested in who our customers are, what constitutes a customer, what products those customers subscribe to, etc. But once we've got that, then other teams can then use that definition to start building their own data products. And it's this concept of decentralization that's much easier in the cloud than it would have been on-prem. So rather than a central team then having to manage the customer definition that is kind of suitable for everyone in the business, we can have a core customer entity that the other teams can then build off. They can apply new requirements that suit them that don't necessarily apply to everyone in the business.
That's an outstanding best practice and a real world example of how to actually deploy a data mesh, which is a great transition to our next question. Once we talk about use cases, we want to know about the do's and the don'ts, because this is not your first rodeo. You've done this many times before. And so we'll start with the positive. If you were to talk to yourself at the beginning of this journey, what would be the things that you would say, Edward, you got to start with this, or you got to, it's a best practice here, or you got to start this team here, or start with this use case? What comes to mind when you think about these best practices for you?
So the first one for us, I think, is decentralize. And you alluded to this earlier. And this lesson came to us a little bit late in the game, but it kind of stands to reason. If you make data available through self-serve to people in your organization, then inevitably they just want more and more and more. And so what we found initially when we had a central team effectively fulfilling all these data requests was that we just had this big backlog in the queue of data requests. Could we just ingest this new data source? Could we just model this new table? Could we just build this new report? And we just couldn't fulfill it fast enough. And so decentralizing has been extremely helpful there. Effectively, we make product teams responsible for their own data, and we empower them to build the data products that they need by providing tooling to make it as easy as possible. And in doing so, effectively, we distribute the workload, but we also then distribute the knowledge. People building data products have that domain knowledge. They know more about the data they're modeling than we ever could have done. And so that's been really helpful. And I'm talking decentralizing both kind of on a skills level within teams, but also decentralizing in terms of the data itself. So rather than siloing data in one big project, decentralizing it across multiple, for us, Google GCP projects, or it could just be multiple data sets, etc.
And the infrastructure, the way BigQuery is built, does allow you to do that easily by assigning projects. And even on the cost management side, you can do that very well. I'm curious about the talent. Did that change then the type of talent those domains had to hire? Did it change the type of talent you had to hire? How did you manage that? Because a lot of that is also a people equation.
So we solved that by embedding data engineers within product teams. So rather than hiring in external talent, we effectively just trained up people within those teams to be able to use the tooling that we had.
Excellent. So you had your own data engineers that actually were embedded in the business unit so they can enable the construction of these data products in connection with your team. Okay, so that's a huge best practice. What about the flip side of that? What are the things that, are the don'ts, the lessons that you learned along the way that you'd say, hey, watch out when you start this use case or when you start on this journey?
So on the flip side, I talk about decentralizing, but one thing to be careful of is making sure that you don't end up with multiple competing copies of the same thing for no good reason. And keeping on top of that has been a bit of a challenge for us. So it's very tempting for, 10 different teams to create 10 different customer entities. And maybe there are good reasons for that. And maybe there are good practice in terms of keeping that maintained, etc. But often it just leads to confusion. So one big problem for us has been discoverability. If someone wants to find out about the customers and they go and search for our tables, they might find 20, 30 tables that all look like good contenders. How do they know which one to go to? And that's a challenge for us that we've probably not yet resolved fully.
So don't silo data. Make sure you watch out because it has, of course, consequence on confusion, but also has consequence on pure cost of having to store the same data multiple times. Anything else that you think is an important consideration when people are building for these data product structures or this data mesh concept?
Another big one I'd say is automate your infrastructure configuration instead of doing it manually. So for us, we use Terraform, but I know there are other solutions out there as well. But if you want to be able to deploy stuff on at scale and have confidence that if you ever needed to rebuild it, you could do so, use configuration rather than manually deploying infrastructure.
All right, so watch out for silos. Make sure you can automate as much as you can. There's a last bit I'm curious about, this idea of adoption of business intelligence across your organization. I mean, it's pretty amazing that you have 4,000 dashboards and more than half the company is running on Looker. So I'm curious about how you got there. Like, what did you have before, and how did you get to such a good adoption number?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, the only way for people to consume data was to effectively set up a report to be scheduled out to them via email. So Looker has transformed that. It allows people to go and self-serve what they need when they want it, and to deep dive and they can explore data. They can ask the questions that only they need answers to directly without having to have someone build a specific report to them. In terms of getting to, we've got, I think, over half the company now using Looker on a regular basis. The reason for that is just by making it the place to go for the data that they need to do their jobs. So we've got support staff working on telephones. They get, for example, car dealers calling in. Then our telephone analysts can use Looker to then bring up information about that customer in real time. Then they can use that to drive the conversation on the phone.
Excellent. And how did you kind of build the talent to do that? Did you find that you have to hire new people, scale up people, train them on different things? How did Looker kind of change the game for you in this idea of enabling more people to build data products?
So we focused on upskilling internally. So we run training courses at kind of all levels. So for people who just need to consume dashboard content, we run training sessions for teams to show them how to do so. But we've also been upskilling people on how to model the data under the hood. So effectively, teams can build what they need without, again, having to come to this central team.
Well, thank you so much, Edward. That was amazing. We learned about your best practices to embed data engineers inside your business teams to make the data mesh a reality. We learned about avoiding silos and automating with a modern platform so you can effectively scale the creation of your data products across your organization. I could stay here and talk to you for hours, and I really hope that people can reach out to you. In fact, I'd like to invite them to click down on the link down here to get access to more stories like this one. Edward, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Until next time, I'm Bruno Ziza.